Today, we discuss defenseman Erik Karlsson. It seems like we've been waiting and waiting for him to get traded, and it seems like we know where he's headed. It's just a matter of when he will head there. We'll talk about that, as well as a few potential NHL players we would like to see in an NHL documentary. All of this coming up on today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast.
Your Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi and hello, hockey fans. Welcome back to the Locked On NHL podcast, Western Conference Tuesdays, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Dane Lewis, also host of Locked On Stars, and joining me as always on Tuesdays, host of Locked On Wild, Seth Toupal, and we have a great episode lined up for you today. A little bit of Erik Karlsson discussion. It's a pretty weak NHL news cycle right now, but Erik Karlsson seems to still be at the top as we're anticipating some sort of move on from the Sharks to potentially a team on the East Coast. And to close out the final few segments of the episode, a discussion about some players we would like to see represented in a potential NHL documentary, similar to what's being done for the NFL on Netflix right now. For those of you who are football fans, the quarterback series, really entertaining, and we think that there'd be some entertaining prospects in the world of hockey as well. But before we dive in, Seth, how's it going, my friend?
Going well. Just navigating through the last little bit of July, August already here, which means that we are in that 60-ish days. It's more like 70, but 60-ish days before the start of the NHL season. So the countdown clock is starting to tick.
Yeah, that it is. We have some prospect tournaments coming up, and then training camp is here, and that's really where the fun begins. Especially if you're a fan of a specific team, you get to follow the preseason games and see which rookies make it on the team or which veterans get slotted into different positions. That's the nice part about the world of the NHL is the season starts before the puck drops in mid October for the first regular season game. And when you talk about players getting moved around, Erik Karlsson, certainly a player who we expect to be wearing a different sweater on opening night, but there's a big holdup, and I can't help but wonder why. But it seems everything I can find points to Erik Karlsson likely heading to Pittsburgh, maybe Carolina. I've heard Seattle mentioned a few times, even Toronto, but I'm told it's really Pittsburgh, and it seems like that's where Karlsson is interested in going as well. But there's so many different questions that go into this move. How much of the $11.5 million cap hit are the Sharks willing to eat and retain? What do they want back in return? What does Pittsburgh have to offer? I mean, you look at there, if you look at, rankings of NHL farm systems, Pittsburgh's typically at the bottom. So it seems pretty slim in terms of prospects in return. Maybe you want to give some NHL ready talent back. Seth, why do you think that we're continuing to see this holdup? Because when you look at it, Karlsson's easily one of the best prospects on the board in terms of a trade this offseason, yet he hasn't been moved.
Well, I think what we're seeing is the salary becoming just such a huge obstacle for this team. And you mentioned the possibility of retaining salary. Also, the fact that the Penguins have a full roster as of right now. And so here are the things that need to be considered for the Penguins in order to make this thing happen is they can't take on any salary. So not only does San Jose have to retain, but there are going to have to be some salaries that are sent the other way to make the money work. And I was just looking through the Pittsburgh roster at a couple of names that could potentially fit that mold. I look at a guy like Mikael Granlund, who does not have trade protection. You go through the names such as Rickard Rakell. He's got a modified no trade clause. Riley Smith has one as well. Noel Acari, who has one as well. So you got a lot of guys that have trade protection. And so it's possible that one of those guys ends up getting moved to facilitate this deal, but it's way more likely that it's one of those guys that just doesn't. So Granlund jumps off the page of that roster in order to make the money work. You look at a couple of other things as well. for the Sharks, then it becomes, what do you get in return? And it's a Sharks team that has a lot of spots for improvement, but I think the most telling, glaring area, and I know they've addressed that this offseason, is the fact that they have swung and missed at goalies quite frequently. It seems like they've had, I want to say the number is something like 15 goalies since 2007, which just seems absurd. But, from a Wild perspective, Capo Kakinen has struggled in San Jose. Now, it's not entirely his fault, but that just goes to show you is they've gone through guys. They had Aiden Hill, they've had Capo Kakinen, they've had just a ton of other guys that just have not been able to fill that goalie spot consistently. And so that, I think, is something that they are looking for, or going to be looking for in return. And are the Penguins willing to get rid of one of their goalie prospects in this trade to make it happen? It's going to be fascinating because I think the money being as much of an obstacle as it is probably more of a holdup than the prospect return is. If I'm looking into it correctly, I feel like the salary and the retained money is the biggest hurdle. And once that gets agreed to, then I feel like Kyle Dubas is going to be able to find a prospect grouping that is going to be something that San Jose ends up liking.
Absolutely. And, it seems like it could maybe be eye for an eye depending on who gets moved. I know Owen Pickering is a guy who could potentially get traded. Samuel Poulin, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's kind of been the top dog in Pittsburgh in terms of prospects for a while now since he was drafted back in 2019. But it's slim pickings there. And even just from the Pittsburgh side of things, beyond prospects, you want to be careful who you move because you're making a move for a guy like Carlson in order to contend for championships because your star players are in the final stages of their career. Sidney Crosby only has 2 more years left on his deal. Maybe he comes back and signs an extension. And as good as Crosby's continued to be as he continues to age, guys tend to slow down as they get older. Gino is 36. Chris Letang is 36. Both of those guys are still going to be around for a while, or at least the Penguins are going to be paying them for a while. But what production are you going to get? And if you send some of these other players, whether it's a Granlund or Raquel, I mean, these aren't as talented of players as maybe a Malkin or a Crosby, but you need depth. You need pieces like that. I mean, we've seen that the past handful of seasons and really all throughout NHL history is teams with depth win. And you certainly would be adding some defensive depth to go alongside Letang and Jeff Petrie with Erik Karlsson. But what else are you sacrificing? Like you said, whether that be goaltending, NHL ready talent. Cause I think, if you're sending over some late 20s, early 30s NHL level players, I think that benefits the Sharks quite a bit. Similar to what we're seeing happen in Chicago right now, where they're acquiring all of these, I don't want to say washed, but guys that are maybe beyond their prime, your Taylor Halls, Corey Perrys of the world, to not necessarily contend and win championships, but at least build something around their star player and Connor Bedard. And the Sharks are going to be flaunting a lot of young talent here over the next few seasons. Guys like Will Smith or even William Eklund, who's kind of starting to dip his toes into the NHL world. I think that there could be some benefit for them of having some sappy veterans that have played on a competent club over the past handful of seasons, as Pittsburgh was a playoff team a couple seasons ago and almost made it this past year. I mean, they're in a pretty good spot overall. I think that there could be some benefit there, but it's just a matter of what the Sharks can get from Pittsburgh. And I feel like the Sharks kind of hold maybe not all the cards, but they seem to be in the advantage here outside of losing a 25 goal over 100 point defenseman.
Yeah, because they can facilitate, the money side of this, but then what is Pittsburgh going to have to offer to up the ante if they do that? Like, let's say San Jose says, "Yeah, we'll retain 50% for the next 4 seasons." What if they go above that? What sort of compensation does that look like? And for San Jose too, another interesting thing to consider with this um, negotiation is if they get players who are kind of the salary swaps, as I'll call them, best case scenario for them is those guys come in and they kind of light it up to where then they would be available to be moved for additional assets if somebody comes knocking at the trade deadline to come in and grab somebody to help out their team. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like blue chip prospects for San Jose right now. If they can get somebody and flip them again, that's a win for them as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and perhaps with this magnitude of a move, with the cap hit for Erik Karlsson, maybe you throw in a third team somewhere along the way as well, and if that happens, who knows what assets are sent out from that team, whether it be players, draft picks, or prospects. And we all know that the Pittsburgh Penguins certainly are not shy about, or at least historically have not been shy about trading away their draft assets, especially first round picks. And they do have their first and second round pick for the 2024 draft right now. And I would have to imagine that one or both of those are on the table for a move for Erik Karlsson. You know, if they're going to plan to go on a deep run over the next handful of seasons, while they for sure still have Sidney Crosby, it's probably worth it in their eyes. They probably don't want those draft picks. They're hoping that they'd be getting a late first round pick anyway. It's one of those things where, you know, when you're the GM or in the front office, you got to manage your risks and decide what risks are worth taking and which ones you need to pass on. But it seems like it'd potentially be a good fit for Erik Karlsson in Pittsburgh. I know there's a little bit of change going on there right now with Kyle Dubas in town, but the San Jose Sharks also, I think, should be pretty excited for what they could potentially get in return for Erik Karlsson's services to help build towards their future, which they still have quite a ways to go. But getting Erik Karlsson off the books and starting to move forward, I think would be a pretty nice start for them here in the late stages of the off season. But now that the news is out of the way, Seth and I are going to dive into a little bit of a fun conversation of which NHL players we think would be really fun to follow through a documentary style series. And we'll discuss that here coming up next. But first, we need to say thank you to one of the sponsors of today's episode, our friends over at AG1. AG1 is a daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health. It's something that I drink literally every single day. I gave AG1 a try because I wanted overall better gut health and a boost in energy. I drink AG1 in the mornings before I make my coffee. It helps make me feel unstoppable, ready to tackle the day. AG1 replaces your multivitamin, probiotic, and more in one simple drinkable habit. It's science-driven formulation of vitamins, probiotics, and whole food sourced nutrients. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/NHL network. That's drinkag1.com/NHL network. Check it out today and change your supplement routine for the better. I want to thank you again for making Locked On NHL your first listen of the day. Dane Lewis, Seth Toupal here with you on this Western Conference Tuesdays. And as we discussed in the opening of the show, time to do a little bit of back and forth of some players we would like to see followed, documentary style, similar to what Netflix has done with their quarterback series following Patrick Mahomes, Kirk Cousins, and Marcus Mariota in the NFL. Basically, just following them throughout this past season at their games with their families off the field. And I think that you know, we're at that point in time in the world of creativity and media where fans start to crave this kind of content. I remember, you know, back in the pandemic when, you know, ESPN or whoever made The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan documentary, I feel like that really set the bar high. Of course, there were things before that, 30 for 30 and whatnot, but that really kind of was a revival moment, I think, for the sports documentary. And we're continuing to see that with football, with basketball. I know that there's been some baseball ones, but I feel like we need some good hockey content back out there. And what better than potentially following around a couple players or 2 or 3 players for an entire season, and you know, giving fans an inside look to the ups and downs, the grit and grind of an 82 game regular season, and perhaps even beyond. And so, Seth, we'll start with you. Who's a player that you would enjoy seeing put on display for a full season, and maybe even more if their team goes to the playoffs?
You know, the best part about this is that you can even separate this out by position. And I'm going to start with the goalies. I've got several that I think would be fascinating. And what I like to do a lot of times is throw some hindsight in for these. How fun would it have been to follow Sergei Bobrovsky around for the run to the Cup final for the Florida Panthers, a guy who struggled at points in the regular season, getting a chance to kind of see him go through his routine throughout the week, getting the call to step in the postseason, standing on his head, helping Florida get all the way to the Cup final. I think that would be fantastic. And so, if we're doing like draft picks for this, I think that's probably my first round selection is Sergei Bobrovsky, because not only that, he's a character too. So you get the cherry on top, getting a chance to watch him just silence the best teams in the Eastern Conference. And he has good personality beyond that as well.
Yeah, I think the world of goalies is so fascinating because you have the personality ridden guys. I think back to even with the Stars a handful of seasons ago, following a guy like Anton Hudobin or Ben Bishop would have been really interesting. I think Jake Ottinger poses that too, but my personal favorite pick as of right now would be out east too with Igor Shesterkin. I think it'd be fun to follow a guy who is a proven goalie, a Vezina caliber goalie, but a market that has kind of been deprived of a championship in a while. It was what the mid '90s, the last time the Rangers won the Stanley Cup, and you went through this era where you had Henrik Lundqvist, who's one of the best goalies of maybe our generation of guys that are our age and or at least hockey fans that are our age, but no success. And now you kind of have this next guy in Shesterkin who hasn't reached that level just yet, but clearly is doing something right. And it's a tough hockey market, a fan base that's very passionate, but a passionate player as well. Shesterkin's very hard on himself when he loses, and the Rangers are just an interesting team in general. I think Shesterkin would be a fun watch at times, but also it could be a pretty nail biting watch at times as well.
My next selection for this year. So use the hindsight. Now we're going to go with for this coming season. Somebody that's a little closer to both of our respective teams, a Central Division opponent, Connor Hellebuck. Because let's talk this out. So the Jets have jettisoned, pun fully intended, a couple of players off the roster this season. There obviously were the comments after the year from Rick Bowness about how his team performed against Vegas in the postseason. Not great. Um, but watching Hellebuck go about his business with him being in the final year of his deal and not willing to sign an extension in Winnipeg, to see how that plays out would be, I think, golden for any crew that was doing any sort of a documentary, because there's a good chance he gets traded. And so you have then all of the workings of how to deal with that during the season. I feel like there is a potential gold mine for a documentary with Connor Hellebuck this season.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that would add a whole new layer as you follow a guy who's rumored to be traded at some point. So you start the season in Winnipeg, and then you end up in Los Angeles or maybe somewhere out east, Carolina, depending on how their goalie situation works out. And Hellebuck in general, I think, has a pretty interesting story of just what kind of where he developed his game. I know he spent a lot of time kind of in the western part of Texas in Odessa playing hockey down there. I mean, not a traditional hockey area as someone who grew up in that part of the state of Texas, but ended up making it to the NHL and being a very proven goalie, a proven winner across a good chunk of his career. I think that that'd be an interesting follow as well. And kind of sticking with the desert motif, I know that, we were discussing this before recording. You can't just, plug in a bunch of big superstar names. You couldn't have a, McDavid, McCarr, and, Olmark. That it would be fun, but there'd be too much ground to cover. But I think that
Yeah.
you could even find a superstar in a smaller market, or maybe, for lack of a better term, a struggling team. I think Clayton Keller would be a very fun follow. Just the Coyotes, you could make a whole documentary series on the Coyotes organization right now and what they're going through. But I think it'd be fun to spotlight Clayton Keller and just kind of see what his day-to-day routine is like. I mean, because he's a very good player who I feel like doesn't often get the respect that he's warranted just because he's on a team that doesn't win a ton. They play in an arena that holds 5,000 people. But when you watch him play, and I know you and I get to see plenty of him, being that he's in the same division as the teams we cover, he's a special player. So there'd be plenty of on ice content. But I think there'd be some really interesting bits off the ice as well, with just with what's going on with that Arizona organization.
Yeah, you would definitely get a little peek behind the curtain as to the kind of feel of Mullet Arena behind the scenes, but also, as you alluded to, the kind of uneasiness and up in the air feeling that is currently permeating through Arizona about the future of the Coyotes. So I think that's a fantastic pick. Again, because it's something that a lot of people don't get the chance to see all the inner workings of. And so this is something kind of myself as well is you hear about a team relocating and you just assume that they kind of pick up and go. Like there is a lot that goes into it if it ever gets to that point with the Coyotes. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's when we started brainstorming for this, that's where my mind first went of what's going to be, the juiciest piece of content in terms of all across the board, and a really good player on the ice, but then a really intriguing, full of twist and turn storyline off the ice, and maybe it could be too much to follow, but I think there's certainly something there. But I think there's a good case to be made for some other teams as well. I think Anaheim, you follow a Trevor Zegras player who kind of has built this polarizing reputation of skilled player, but maybe sometimes talks a little bit too much or gets himself in trouble. Those mic'd up segments, I think, would be very interesting on the ice, to say the least. Or even in San Jose, maybe Karlsson doesn't get dealt before the season, and you have him in terms of guys who are going to get moved in the middle of the season. I think Karlsson in particular, that mixed with trying to follow up one of the best performances we've seen from a defenseman in terms of production and points, and trying to replicate that after people had kind of written Erik Karlsson off for the most part. I mean, he had some really good days in Ottawa, and then when he comes to San Jose, it kind of seemed like he was done being the Erik Karlsson that a lot of us remembered. But at least for one season, that was not the case.
Yeah, it would be fascinating as well to deal with a player who, so we talk about Hellebuck as likely to be traded. What about getting somebody on the other side of that coin where the rumors just continue to swirl, but the deal is just too difficult to get done? How does a player deal with those types of situations as well? I think that's a real solid selection as well.
Yeah, and I think another category similar is players that have been bought out recently and are like a Matt Duchene. I think would be an interesting follow. And there's of course a team that I'm most familiar with, plenty of good Dallas Stars options. This might be Joe Pavelski's last year, and the Stars social media team likes to plug some Pavelski family content on the feed anyway. So I think that there'd be, for people that have watched the NFL series, I think that there's a lot of Kirk Cousins comparisons there of a guy who has a lot of really nice numbers but hasn't won the big one yet. And Kirk, I think, still has a few more years left, but Joe Pavelski, this could be the last ride. I think that's interesting. uh, Robertson, Hintz, Ottinger, and I'm sure even from Minnesota's perspective, you look at a guy like Kirill Kaprizov, and I know there's such kind of a Russia in general is just kind of a gray area with the NHL right now. We saw it at the draft with how late Michkov got drafted, and I remember last year it was like, oh, are we going to be able to get our Russian players back in time for the season? There was kind of that whole you know, disruption almost of we didn't really know what the situation was there. I don't know if that's something the NHL would necessarily want to dive into, but it could be interesting. And I know maybe, not all the Russian players always have the most personality. At least that's what I've seen on the teams I watch the most. But not everyone's Ovechkin, but I think that there is something there in terms of story, maybe.
Well, and I've got a dandy of one that I looked into on Locked On Wild yesterday. How about Marc Andre Fleury,
Mm.
who currently sits 8 wins behind Patrick Waugh for second all time in wins for a goalie. So you have that. You have a guy who is a pretty good character as it is, and you have a guy who is likely playing in his final season. So you put all of those storylines together. um, I'm not saying Netflix, but if you do go that route, I would like a finder's fee for coming up with that idea for you.
Just
Flurry
in
would
general,
be
if
he'd
anyone
be a great pick, I think.
if anyone at Netflix finds this and wants to, I know my DMs are open. I'm pretty sure Seth's are as well. If you want,
Yep.
we will gladly hop on this project, whatever that looks like. Uh, yeah, I think it'd be a ton of fun, and I feel like we could do this for an hour, just naming guys like, oh, this would be interesting for this reason. Even I mean, in the name of records, Ovechkin, who I mentioned a second ago, maybe not this season, but if he's around for 2 seasons from now when he's probably a little bit closer because he needs what 70 something goals to be the the all-time leader in goals scored, if I'm not mistaken. Is it goals, points? I can't remember exactly.
Believe it's
Goal.
goals.
Okay. Yeah, because points would be a lot because Wayne Gretzky was a cheat code in the
Yeah.
NHL, was a very different sport. But I think he's like 70 or 71 goals away. It's probably not happening this year, but you look even 2 years from now, and if he's still around and has a chance to break that record, and who knows what that Capitals team would look like, I think that'd be fun as well.
I just because it's kind of a personal tie to Minnesota, I do have one more. I would love to get a little something from Vancouver.
Mm,
Somebody from Vancouver who was inside while all that mess was going on in the final stages of the Bruce Boudreau era, moving into Rick Tocchet. So that I think would be a fascinating one as well, because I still am a little frosty at how that all played out in basically just kind of hanging a guy out to dry and being like, well, yeah, we're going to fire you at the end of the weekend, but we still want you to come to work uh,
yeah,
anyway.
yeah, that would be such an interesting follow. And there's probably a lot of teams that fit that billing to some extent of a coach is maybe on their last leg. And of course, we'd be remiss, even though we're mostly talking about West teams here. Toronto, of course, just with everything that goes into that organization of the lack of playoff success and the amount of talent on that team, you could kind of pick and choose. But I feel like Austin Matthews was a pretty easy choice, but you could go Mitch Marner as well. And I think that they're, especially this season with Kyle Dubas gone, and you finally did get that big win of a series, but then you got destroyed by the Panthers. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of different avenues you could pick with that. And Ovechkin officially 72 goals away from tying Wayne Gretzky. So I guess he needs 73 to get 895 goals all time. So maybe put a pin in that for the next 2 or 3 seasons if Ovechkin is still playing. And I think that you have a pretty interesting storyline to follow there. But I feel like we'll have to stop there. Otherwise, we'll just continue to ramble on and on. And it's a fun discussion to be had for sure, and hopefully we'll get some sort of content made here in the future with the Last Dance being made and this quarterback series and whatnot. I think opening the door for more of this content being craved by sports fans across multiple different sports and cities and markets and things of that nature. So hopefully, maybe someone at Netflix will stumble across this podcast, and that's all it takes. But we appreciate you tuning in to today's episode of Locked On NHL. Seth, let the people know where they can find you and find all of your Minnesota Wild related work.
You can follow me on Twitter at Seth Toups. You can also follow the show at Locked On Wild. Every social media platform that exists, just search Locked On Wild. You'll find what we have to offer as we continue to gear up for the season. We've got Locked On Wild Boot Camp starting on August 1st. So keep that in mind. If you want to get the intel on everything Minnesota Wild related ahead of the season, make sure you check out Locked On Wild Boot Camp starting August 1st.
Good. And everything Locked On Stars related can be found in the same place, YouTube, your favorite podcasting platform. Lots of speculation right now about opening night roster and what the lines look like with new acquisitions. And we even started the debate on Monday of who the overall best Dallas Stars player is. Not most valuable or necessarily most talented, but just the pound for pound best all around player. And it's been a pretty good discussion so far. It wasn't as one sided as I thought it might be. And we're going to continue to have those sort of discussions and friendly open debates here over the next handful of weeks as we're continuing to count down the days for training camp, and the NHL season will of course be here before we know it. But thank you again for tuning in and making Locked On NHL your first listen every single day.